All right, I think we have nearly everybody back, so I will get us started on our next topic. So this is the last thing we're going to talk about before lunch, and at the teacher's request, we're actually going to finish this morning session a little bit earlier, so you have a slightly longer lunch break. We'll come back at the same time, we'll come back at 2, but I'm going to try to finish about half an hour earlier than we planned. So in this session, we are going to talk about evidence comparison. So we're going to practice kind of what to do in the common situation in debate when you have one piece of evidence on one side and another piece of evidence on the other, and they say opposite things. And so where do we go from there? How do we compare? How do we make our argument that says our piece of evidence is better or should be preferred? But before we go into that, I want to hear a little bit from some of you. So just at a very broad and basic level, why do we read evidence? What's the point of reading evidence? What do we think? Why bring up evidence at all? What if I just gave a super persuasive speech that sounds really smart and makes all of my arguments? I don't need to cite anyone. What are we trying to achieve using evidence?
It gives whatever your claim is the ground.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So one reason we read evidence is because we want to use that evidence to provide support for what we're saying, or grounds, like Brian said. How does evidence do that? I think there's a couple ways. How does evidence help us support what we're saying?
By giving us of more professional knowledge from other professional people's professors.
Yeah, so that's one reason. So one way that evidence helps support our arguments is because that evidence is credible, right? So we're reading a piece of evidence from someone who hopefully knows what they're talking about. There may be an expert. And so the fact that an expert agrees with us helps us support our argument because it proves that what we're saying has some weight behind it because some experts think it's true. Okay. How else does evidence help us support our arguments?
Because it provides statistics.
Sure. So if we think about it in terms of Toulmin's model, right, what you're getting at there is the actual data or evidence part, right? So evidence can provide facts about the world, it can provide statistics, and it can provide, all kinds of different information that we can use to support our position, right? I think there's one other level that we're missing. So we have credibility. Evidence can boost our credibility, and evidence can provide statistics. What else can evidence do? Think about Toulmin's model a little bit. What's the level that we're missing? We've got the claim that's coming from us, right? And we've got our credible experts supporting our claim. We've got evidence and statistics. So what's the third thing that our evidence can support?
Warrant.
Yeah, exactly. So evidence that supports a claim can just be one sentence. It can be, I think that raising taxes hurts the economy, and so does this professor, right? That helps support the claim. It shows, hey, there's someone else that agrees with me, right? Then we have some evidence that can be provided by the evidence. So maybe I'll read a piece of evidence that says, in 1995, taxes were really high and the economy didn't grow that much. But then in the year 2000, taxes went down and then the economy grew. Maybe I have a statistic about that. And that's evidence providing support for our, our data level or our evidence level. And then we have warrants. And so that might be, I don't know, somebody might write an article saying, when taxes are really high, people don't want to spend money because they don't make as much money from their investments. So it reduces how much money people are willing to invest, and that hurts the economy. So that provides a kind of warrant. That's an example of one warrant for this claim. And that is a third way that evidence can kind of support what we're talking about. So basically, at the most foundational level, when we are doing evidence comparison, what we're really doing is we are evaluating the evidence's ability to support us on each of those different levels, right? So we're evaluating the quality of the person saying it. So how qualified are they? We're evaluating the quality of the statistics or data they're providing. So does the statistic cover a large enough time period? Does it include enough information, etc.? And we're evaluating the quality of the warrants. Does the reasoning that the person provides make sense? Are they tying the data to the claim in a way that is logical or that we can understand, right? So all of these factors are kind of the most basic level of comparing two pieces of evidence to each other. Beyond that, there are some fancier questions you could ask, but I think that if you master those most basic levels, you will do pretty much fine. And that is the most basic level of evidence comparison that we need to do. And that's kind of on this slide that I'm showing now, that's kind of what is included under step one. So does it provide relevant data? Does it provide a relevant logical argument? Does it originate from a qualified source who we should trust to know what they are talking about? So that's kind of step one. That is the basic reasons why we would need a piece of evidence. Beyond that, I would say we have a couple of trickier things that we could go into about a piece of evidence that can help us tell two pieces of evidence apart, even if both of them have strong data, strong warrants, and strong qualifications. So one is the evidence conclusive? Does anyone have any idea what I mean by conclusive? Any guesses?
Not too lengthy.
Not too lengthy? Well, so actually that is something that might make a piece of evidence good, but that's not really something that's relevant for evidence comparison. So when we're talking about evidence comparison, what I mean is, so for those of you who have done English debate already, either policy or non-policy, most of your evidence comparison so far probably happened during the cross-examination. You probably asked your opponents a question such as, hey, this evidence that you cite only asks 30 different people. 30 is not that many. Why should we believe that the statistic, why should we draw conclusions from this statistic about just 30 people, right? That's a kind of question that you could have asked in the cross-examination, and that would have been a good question. In public forum, since we have two whole speeches, right, the summary and the final focus, where they're basically the whole purpose of the speeches is for you to make comparisons between arguments, we have to go into way more detail about our evidence comparison, right? So they've presented some evidence and they're constructive, you've presented some evidence to respond in your rebuttal, and vice versa. You've presented your constructive and they've responded in their rebuttal. So we have evidence that says the opposite. And how can we tell which one is better? So when we're putting together our speeches, short and sweet can be good, but you can't really stand up in your speech and be like, you should prefer our evidence over theirs because it's shorter. So good point, but not exactly for this purpose. So by conclusive, I mean something else. Does anyone have an idea? Conclusive.
Is it critical?
Critical? What do you mean by that?
Like to be focused, not to evident, it's straight to the point.
Yeah, I think you're on the right track there. So what I mean by conclusive is what it's reaching a conclusion. So I think, Chelsea, that's what you mean by straight to the point, right? It's getting to a conclusion about what it's saying, right? So sometimes when you read academic sources, so if you're reading, let's say, a journal or you're reading a study, you might see a study that goes something like this. Oh, it's very controversial. Let's say this is a study about social media. It's like, oh, there's people who think that social media is bad for democracy. There's people who think it's good for democracy. And I'm going to do a literature review. And here's my summary of all of the reasons why it's good for democracy. Here's my summary of all the reasons it's bad for democracy. And, we need more study in this area. Then the essay is over. So could you cite this essay? Could you cite the part of this essay where it's summarizing points in your favor and then use that as your argument? Sure, you could, but it's not conclusive. It's not reaching a conclusion or an opinion on the issue. It's just describing arguments for each side. Those of you who have done research for debate topics before, give me a react if you've seen an article that looks like this before. Yeah, Brian's seen one. Yeah, those of you who have not seen one yet, you will at some point in your debate career, I promise you. So articles that read like that, they're okay. They're not the best. The best articles are the ones that take a position on which side they believe is better. Brian, do you have a question?
Yes, but in real debate, you can't possibly have the time to check your opponent's pieces of evidence this thoroughly. And so I'm wondering, like, how can you figure out if it's conclusive or not?
That's a good question. So you are right that you will not be able to do this for every single piece of evidence. So I'll go into this in a little bit more detail in a second, but the answer to your question is basically that you have to pick your battles and you have to decide basically which section of the debate you think is the most important, and you want to ask to see their evidence on that issue and try to get it to the bottom of that particular question. So that's one thing, is just, yes, you're right, you're not going to be able to do it for every piece of evidence, but if you think there's one issue where you want to make sure you're doing your best evidence comparison, you can focus on that and ask to see their evidence for that particular claim and see if you can skim through it to figure out which side their evidence is taking or if their evidence reaches a conclusion. Something else that will also be helpful, and we'll get into this in more detail in the second half of today, but in public forum, usually when people present evidence, we are going to be quoting from the evidence directly. So usually, I think when you all have presented evidence in your speeches in the past, what you all have done is mostly just paraphrased. So you would look at the evidence and you would give your summary of what the evidence says. And in public forum, that's sometimes okay. I think Shanna described sometimes when it's okay, mainly when the study is just super, super long and it's impossible to get a short quote from it. But most of the time, when you're citing a piece of evidence, you'll be using direct quotes from that piece of evidence. And based on those quotes, you can usually kind of tell if the evidence is conclusive or if the evidence it meets some of these other issues that I'll talk about in a second. A conclusive piece of evidence will say something like, based on our research, we found blank. Or it might say something like, we believe blank. Whereas a piece of evidence that is not conclusive might say something like, some authors say blah, blah, blah. Other authors say blah, blah, blah. Or critics argue blah, 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 right? So based on the quotes, you will be able to tell a little bit more about whether the evidence is conclusive or not. So that's kind of my two waves of answer. One is focus down and ask to see their evidence about the most important parts of the debate. And two is, if they're quoting from the evidence directly, you can sometimes tell from the quote how strong the claims that are being made are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's clearer. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Another thing that sets apart good evidence and the best evidence is whether or not it is causal. So causal means, is it describing a cause and effect relationship? In debate, we are usually talking about whether a resolution causes good or bad things. So here we are talking about whether social media causes good things for democracy or causes bad things for democracy. So a causal piece of evidence might say something like, social media causes the spread of conspiracy theories, right? Social media makes conspiracy theories worse, right? So that is a causal claim. It is a cause and effect. Cause, social media, effect, spreading conspiracy theories. A piece of evidence that is not causal might say something like this, we live in an age of social media and there are many conspiracy theories happening right now, right? So that's not making a causal claim. It's just saying, hey, there's two things happening at once and they're both increasing. So it's not really making a claim about which is making the other worse. It's just kind of saying both of them exist. So causal evidence, really good in debates. We should be preferring causal evidence usually over evidence that does not speak to cause and effect.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
You said that one way to identify if this evidence is conclusive is see from contention. I forgot what is the another one.
Oh yeah, so yeah, one is you can ask to see their evidence, and if it's about the most important part of the debate, you should definitely ask to see it and make sure you read through it and scrutinize it more closely. The second thing, though, is that when we present evidence in public forum, we will usually be doing it by using direct quotes. So in your actual speech, you will read sections from the article out loud that represent your point. And based on the language that you are quoting, you can kind of tell what type of evidence you're dealing with. Are you dealing with a conclusive or a not conclusive argument? Are you dealing with a causal or a not causal argument, right? Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So conclusiveness and causality are two. Comparative evidence is also usually better. So this whole exercise we're doing, or this whole subject we're talking about, is evidence comparison. And that's because when we are giving our speech, we are usually going to have to do that evidence comparison ourselves. We're going to have to make an evaluation and say, their evidence is bad for these reasons, our evidence is better for these reasons. Comparative evidence is really nice because if you have a piece of evidence that is already making comparisons for you, you don't need to do them yourself. Your evidence is doing them for you already. So an example of that could be a piece of evidence that says, so there's one really famous study in the effect of social media on democracy. It's about voter turnout. It's a study that says when you put more people on social media, more people end up showing up to vote, and that's really good. And to get this claim, this study used 66 million pieces of data. They looked at 66 million people to try to figure out whether people on social media are more likely to vote. And built into this evidence, there is a section in the actual article where it says, there's no other study that is this big. Our study is really good. It's better than all the other studies because of how much data we collected. We collected 66 million pieces of data. So anyone who disagrees with us, all those studies are worse. They don't have as much information as we do. That's a comparative piece of evidence, right? Because if your opponent reads an article that says, oh, look, we did our own study and we found, like, no, being on social media does not make you more likely to vote. You can cite your author and say, look, our expert says that it's really, really important to have lots of data on this issue. And they have it. They have 66 million pieces of data. Our opponents don't have that, so you should prefer our evidence. That's one example of a comparison that could be made, but the evidence could make all kinds of comparisons that are useful for you. So that's just something to keep an eye out for. Oh, Brian, do you still have a question, or is your hand just up from earlier?
No, I don't have a question.
Okay. Does anyone else have a question? Okay. The last kind of extra category I would think about is this pretty broad category of, does this evidence have good reasoning? Is it well reasoned? And the reason this is broad is because it kind of captures all of the other differences that you can have between multiple pieces of evidence in terms of the quality of the argument they're making. So one piece of evidence might have, one set of warrants, and another piece of evidence might have a different set of warrants. Which one of those warrants makes more sense, right? Is one of them more logical? Does your opponent's evidence make sense? Is it consistent? Like, do all the warrants make sense together, right? So that is kind of the last category that I would look out for. A lot of times, I think that debaters get nervous questioning how well reasoned an opponent's piece of evidence is because you think you're not qualified to do that. Like, you hear a piece of evidence from someone else and they say, like, oh, it's this professor, and this professor is saying that, this professor is making this argument, and you're thinking, oh, they're so smart, they're a professor, so it automatically must be true. And that's not the way that I would look at it. For one thing, professors say things that are wrong all the time. Just the fact that there's two pieces of evidence that say the opposite already tells you, right? One of those people is wrong. So professors make mistakes, right? Two things that are the opposite can't necessarily both be true. So you all are already really good at finding holes in your opponent's contention. So the arguments your opponents are making. And you are poking holes on them with your questions, and you're poking holes on them in your speeches. Don't be afraid to do the same thing to your opponent's evidence. So just because it's in a piece of evidence written by someone qualified does not mean it is above scrutiny. Make sure that you're applying the same critical eye to the evidence that you are applying to the contention that your opponent has written. Does all of that make sense to people? Or are there any questions before I move on? Give me a thumbs up if you are good with everything I said. Awesome, love to see it. Okay. So how do we do evidence comparison in our actual debates? So like I mentioned earlier, this usually takes place in the summary and final focus speeches. So recall last time when we practiced our line by line a little bit, right? So something, so evidence comparison is one example of something that would go in your line by line refutation, right? So let's say you read your constructive, they read their rebuttal. And you have two pieces of evidence that say the opposite things. One says China's spreading fake news in Taiwan using social media. The other says they're not, right? So as you're doing line by line, one of the things you could say is, they say China's not spreading fake news in Taiwan through social media. That's wrong. Our evidence from our constructive says that they are spreading it, and it gives two examples of fake news that has been spread by China. You should prefer our evidence. One, it's more recent. Their evidence does not take into account recent examples of fake news spreading. Two, our evidence is more qualified. Our evidence is from a professor. Their evidence is from some random newspaper, right? So that's an example. Useful phrases to do this. So you saw me use the first two just now. Prefer our evidence because whatever, it's more recent, it's more conclusive. Our evidence makes a causal claim, right? Their evidence is blank while ours is blank, and that matters because blank. That's also a great phrase. Their evidence is from a newspaper while our evidence is from a professor. This matters because a professor is more qualified to interpret the data, whereas a newspaper is just reporting what they see, and it's a secondary source rather than a primary one that does its own research, right? And you can put anything in those blanks, right? Their evidence does not respond to the warrant in our evidence about blank, and that matters because blank, right? Their evidence does not respond to the warrant in our evidence about how China is paying people in Taiwan to spread fake news, not just doing it from China itself. That matters because their evidence assumes that the only examples of Chinese fake news are the ones that come from China. And our evidence says that's wrong. And many examples happen within Taiwan itself. Do those examples make sense to people? Okay. Calling for evidence. This is what I was describing earlier. So calling for evidence is something that you can do during the crossfire mainly. So if you want to see a piece of evidence that is being referenced by your opponent and you want to look at it more closely, you can use crossfire time to ask them, hey, what is the source for whatever claim? And they will have to provide you with the piece of evidence that they were using to support their claim. And then you can pull it up, you can look at it more closely, and you can make more detailed comparisons based on what you read. Because you have a team and not everybody is talking at once, basically every point in the debate is time when somebody can be reading through evidence to try to make comparisons, right? So let's say, one of your partners is talking, they're giving their rebuttal speech. That's time you can be using to be reading through the evidence in your opponent's constructive and jotting down ideas for how to make comparisons about it later. Or, if let's say you called for a piece of evidence in the crossfire and now it's prep time. That's a great chance for you to be reading through your opponent's evidence and coming up with comparisons that you can make about why their evidence was worse than yours. This is another big change compared to English debates that you all have been having so far. Because in previous debates, you have had two opponents to focus on, right? You are defending your side, but there's two different teams on the opposing side. And they've introduced all sorts of different arguments, and you don't have time in your speech to cover every single one. Here, you only have one opponent, so you can be laser focused. There's probably only two contentions in the debate that you have to deal with and respond to. So you have time in your speeches to deal with every single component of what your opponent is saying, right? And you can look at each level of what they've said with this critical and deep eye. And that's because, you know, there's only one opponent and you don't have to spread your focus across all the different people. And the last point, using evidence to compare evidence, I kind of already brought this up. So this was just the idea that you can read a piece of evidence that is already comparative, and that will help you make comparisons in the future. Any questions about any of this? Oh, Brian, so one other thing that I want to mention is evidence comparisons are something that you can prepare in advance. So, for example, you don't know this yet because we haven't talked about the topic in a lot of depth or about research in a lot of depth, but we'll go into this in more detail after lunch. But there's one article that is amazing at talking about the effect of fake news in Taiwan on social media. And if you are debating a team that is bringing up fake news in Taiwan on social media, probably they are citing this article. There's not that many articles they could cite. So as you're doing research, once you kind of figure out what are the key sources our opponents can cite, you can start thinking about comparisons before the debate even starts. And once you've faced some teams at regionals, you can also remember what evidence they cited against you then, and then you can track it down between regionals and nationals and prepare more detailed comparisons before you debate them again. Benny asks when you would call for evidence. That's a good question. Usually you would call for evidence during the crossfire. So if you ask a question and you're like, what is your reason for this? And they answer, and then you can ask, can you provide the piece of evidence for this? They'll be like, sure, and then they will provide the piece of evidence to you. In US public forum, you can also call for evidence during your prep time. I am not positive about the rules for that in modified public forum, but I think you should be able to call for evidence during prep time as well. It would be my guess, but the exact rule on that is still getting ironed out, so I'm not positive, but you can definitely call for evidence during the crossfire. Any other questions? That's a great one.
Can you give us an example of the third phrase, like how we can use it or how it is used?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Okay, so let's say we're comparing two pieces of evidence about whether or not economic growth causes war. So I'm a political science major in college, so we're going to use that political science knowledge. So one piece of evidence says economic growth prevents war. And its reason is that countries that are trading with each other, you know, their trade is valuable to them, so they don't want to lose it by fighting. And then the other piece of evidence for the opposite side says, no, economic growth does not prevent war, because if you look at the 1983 Falklands War, the economies of Argentina and the Falklands Islands were growing and they went to war anyway, right? So you could have two pieces of evidence like that. If you are on the side of economic growth prevents war, you could say something like, their evidence does not respond to the warrant in our evidence about how economic growth makes countries depend on one another and become valuable trading partners, which are too valuable for them to lose through fighting. Their evidence only uses one example, which doesn't disprove this broad thesis argument. That matters because their evidence might be talking about an exception to the rule, whereas our evidence says that most of the time, economic growth is really, really powerful. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. So we are going to do a brief activity where we are going to compare some evidence. So I'm going to give you access to a document here. So if you go to the chat, I have posted a link to the document that we are going to look at in the chat. So everyone open that. So we don't have a ton of time. So there are 3 examples in this document. I think it'll be better if we just do one. And if you want to think about examples number 2 and 3 at some point later on your own, you can definitely feel free to do that. But here is what we are going to do. So you all have group numbers. So you all are either in an odd number group, so 1, 3, 5, or 7, or you're in an even group, so 2, 4, 6, and 8. If you are in an even group, you are going to want to say that evidence A under evidence comparison 1 is better than evidence B. And the odd number group should say evidence B is better than evidence A. So to do this, what you need to do is give these pieces of evidence a read. You can look at the qualifications of the authors. You can look at how good their warrants are, how good their data is, anything that you want to use to make a comparison, and try to list some reasons why your piece of evidence should be preferred over the other side. The question these pieces of evidence are disagreeing about is whether democracy prevents war. So Dr. Larry Diamond in evidence A says democracy does prevent war, and Rensky Durensplit says that democracy does not prevent war. So I will give you all some time to read through this, and then I want to hear from you all about some comparisons.
So we're only doing evidence comparison 1.
Yeah, we're only doing number 1 for now. And if you want to do the other ones later, you can do that on your own time. But I want to let you all go for lunch, so we have time to eat. These articles are a little bit tricky. So if you come across a word or a phrase that you do not recognize, make sure to first Google it and see if that helps you. And second, feel free to message the chat and ask what a word or a phrase means, and I will be happy to help you out. As you are prepping for the season with your teams, this is part of what your teachers are here for. So if you are having trouble understanding something, this is something that your teachers will be able to help you out if Google cannot help you. So for now, I am your teacher, so feel free to ask me. All right. Let's hear from someone in the even group. So someone who said evidence A is better than evidence B. Does anyone want to share? So I guess before we even do that, does someone want to just tell us what evidence A says? Just give us a quick summary. Anyone? Let's see. This is even number groups. Let's see. Yeah, Yanhan, do you want to give it a try?
Okay, so evidence number 8 supports the democratic peace theory, saying that democracies is more peaceful than autocratics.
Yes, great. What are some reasons why it says that that is true? So provide some examples, it gives some warrants. But yeah, Yahan, you're exactly right. And democratic peace theory is an important phrase for sure, because that's something that describes this type of argument. But what kinds of examples or reasons does this evidence provide? Let's see. I'm looking at my list. I'm going to call on someone random. Let's hear from Alan. We got Alan in here. No? Okay. Do we have a, let's see. Sean, what do you think?
For evidence B.
No, you were even. So what, give me some reasons or some evidence that is in evidence A.
It says that for throughout history, the US and the European countries were fighting against authoritarian countries, and the most solid way to prevent problems in Africa and South America is to strengthen the democracy, democratic system in these regions in order to prevent the power of like Russia, China, or Iran, North Korea, or ISIS to influence these places.
Yeah, great. So you're exactly right. So mainly the way this evidence makes its argument is it's giving a bunch of examples. It says democracies are way more peaceful. And how do we know this? We can look at a bunch of examples of non-democracies. We got Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, poor states in Africa, in Central America, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, ISIS. All of these are examples of non-democracies. And according to this author, it's those non-democracies that are the biggest causes of war. Nice. That is a great summary of what this evidence is using as its justifications. And for the record, does this person seem qualified?
Yes, since he's a professor in a lot of schools.
Yeah, he's a professor at Stanford. He works at a think tank. He is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, which is a school within Stanford. So yeah, this guy, he's got a super cushy academic position, so he probably should take what he says pretty seriously. All right, so that's a great summary. What about evidence B? What does evidence B talk about? Someone from the odd number groups, help us out. This evidence was shorter, but I think the words they used in this evidence were a little bit harder. So help us out. Let's see, Alicia, do you have an idea what this evidence was about?
I think I'm even number.
Oh yeah, you are. There's another Alicia, I think,
Okay.
maybe. My list doesn't have all of your English names, so I'm doing my best. No Alicia. Okay. What about Ethan? Ethan and Wang. What do you think?
It says like there's no way you can like prove that democracy actually creates peace.
Yep, that's exactly right. Perfect summary. So this article is saying that there is no way to prove that democracy causes peace. So that idea that one of you mentioned earlier, democratic peace theory, is wrong. Great. Okay, so does this article have any reasons for this claim? Someone help Ethan out. Someone else with an odd number. Give me a reason that this article says to support its claim that democracy does not prevent war.
It used different studies. Like I think this professor mostly focused on different studies, like or hypotheses. Like,
Yeah, so they're giving kind of a summary, right? Yeah. No, yeah, you're exactly right. So they're providing an overview of lots of different studies. So here they said there's not a strong relationship between democracies and war. There are other explanations for war that explain why the data makes it look like democracy solves war. The theoretical reasons for why democracy would cause peace are weak, right? Democracies are not more peaceful in general. And when countries become democracies for the first time, they're actually more unstable. So lots of different arguments or warrants for why democracy does not cause war. Does this evidence have data within the actual evidence that is being quoted here? Is there any data? What do we think?
No.
Yeah, so there's no data in this actual paragraph. There's probably some data in these studies that this professor is referring to, but there's no data in this actual paragraph. All right, so we've got evidence A, which says democracy solves war, and gives a bunch of examples of why. And then we have evidence B, which says, no, democracy does not solve war. We have statistics that disprove this idea. So someone from an even group, let's hear an argument for why evidence A should be preferred over evidence B. So think about the example sentences that I gave earlier, right? So you should prefer our evidence because our evidence does X thing and their evidence does Y thing, and that matters because of a reason, or there's a warrant in our evidence that theirs doesn't answer, and that matters because. So try to think of those examples. Does someone want to give it a try? Benson says it is more authoritative. Okay, explain what you mean by that.
Well, in the evidence A, the author has been many places professor. So I think he is more he's he has more views than the evidence based author.
Okay, so this person, yeah, they have a bit of a fancier job. So Stanford is a little bit of a fancier university than Warwick, and they also work at this think tank, the Hoover Institution, right? So yeah, I would say maybe this person has a slightly fancier job title than this guy. But you know, I think that's a pretty small difference. So it's a good start, and qualifications are definitely a good thing to look at. But I think both of these people are pretty qualified, even if one is slightly more qualified. But that's a good idea. Anyone else got an idea? Or if you think evidence B is better, you can feel free to share that too.
I prefer evidence A because it
Okay.
provides more example and countries, which is data, and data adds factuality to our argument.
Okay, awesome. So our evidence gives specific examples, and that matters because that data adds some kind of credibility to our argument. Awesome. So great, you looked at a characteristic of the evidence and you made a comparison. In evidence B, there's no examples being given, so maybe we should prefer the evidence with examples. Team B, what do we think about that? You've been challenged. Yenhan thinks your evidence isn't good. Yenhan doesn't care for it. She thinks there's no examples there. Are you all just gonna stand there and take that? Or are you gonna defend Rensky Duran's fleet here? What do we think? Let's see who we got on the odd team here. Andrea, what do you think about this accusation? If you're not sure, it's okay. So what are you thinking about right now?
Well, I mean, obviously, even though I'm on like evidence, I mean, I'm supposed to be on the side of evidence B. I do feel like evidence A is better.
Okay. Well,
it's more like elaborative.
Yeah, no, that's true. So evidence A does go into way more detail, and it provides many more examples, like Yanhan described. But you know, in a debate, you're not always going to have the ability to say the side that you think is the most strongly supported, right? So if you had to make an argument for evidence B, what would you say?
I'm honestly not really sure. I think B is like very, B is like basically, I mean, B is like attacking the other side more, so I guess that's something.
Okay. Sure. So B is actually going through and trying to respond to the other side, whereas A is just sort of explaining their argument. I feel like you're not giving Jordan Spleet enough credit here. So evidence A does bring up some examples of places where non-democracies are aggressive, right? But really, if you look at it, how many examples is it really giving? Like evidence A has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 examples. And some of these examples aren't specific. So like this person claims that just like all of Africa doesn't have any democracies, which like, I mean, not all of Africa is like this, obviously, or not all of Central America is like this. And ISIS isn't even a country. So it's like weird that we're talking about them in this conversation about democracies, you know, they're like a terrorist group. So I feel like it doesn't matter that much, you know? So Diamond has some examples, but there's like not that many, and some of them are kind of weird, right? Whereas what kind of evidence does this article use? Statistics, right? And those statistics are much broader, right? They use much more data. And probably they include the examples being used in evidence A, but they also include all of the other countries, right? So in this case, maybe you could even say that the vagueness or the general nature of evidence B actually makes it better, right? Because it's not relying on those single examples. It's looking at all the countries and it's comparing them to, it's comparing the democracies to the non-democracies, and using statistics, it actually concludes there's no relationship. The democracies are just as aggressive, right? So it's a little bit tricky, right? And one thing that I will say is this is a skill you'll pick up over time. It's a skill that becomes easier the more you know about a topic, right? And the more you research, the more you yourself will get a sense for, oh, this article looks pretty strong, or oh, this article looks pretty weak, right? So as we move into the second half of today, we're going to focus more on this topic specifically, and we're going to talk a lot about research, and we're going to get you all started on actually writing arguments about the social media topic, and we're going to kind of work through that process together. So that will make the process of evidence comparison on this specific issue much easier, I would say. Charlotte has an example of some comparisons that you can make. And so I think these are really strong examples. So prefer evidence B because our evidence directly refutes the link, whereas their evidence doesn't. And prefer evidence A because, because evidence A fails to provide the connection between democracy and peace. Oh, I see. So yeah, so this is all an argument for evidence B. And yeah, this is a great argument. Evidence A just provides some examples of non-democracies that are violent. Evidence B uses broad statistics. And this is an example of how you can use the sentence format we talked about to make that comparison. So yeah, this is great. Does anyone have any questions about this before I let you all go for lunch? Okay. I will spend a couple of minutes. I will set aside a couple of minutes at the beginning of the next session to answer any other questions that come up. So if, as you're having lunch, you think of something you're confused about, make sure to remember it so you can ask as we all kind of come together. The one other thing I will say is, so we're breaking for lunch, and you'll come back in about an hour. So come back at 2. The very first thing we'll do when we come back is we will all turn our cameras on and we will take a very beautiful group picture to remember our time together here. So make sure that your camera is working and you can turn it on so we can see you in our beautiful group photograph. That's the first thing we'll do after we come back from lunch. But for now, thank you all for your hard work, and I will see you in an hour.